Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new edition in our series, in IFCU's series of interviews, Trends and Innovations. Our guest today is Christine Musselin. Christine is a very well-known figure in the French academic sphere. She's a sociologist by training. She's head of research at France's major research institute, Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. More precisely, she's conducting research at the Center of Sociology of Organizations. It's a mixed research unit between Sciences Po on the one hand and the National Center for Scientific Research. She works on comparing systems within the university, and more specifically on university governance, on higher education policies, and the academic workplace. Christine, hello and welcome.
Hello.
Very happy to have you today. You're a true specialist of French higher education. It's a field that you've been researching over the past 2-3 decades. I'll mention a few publications, a few books that you've published on the subject. One is, I'll mention the titles in French. The first one was La longue marche des universités, that was published in 2001. And then La grande course, the great race, La grande course des universités, 2017. And then your most recent publication, your most recent book, 2019, called Proposition d'une chercheuse pour l'université. That's when the researcher starts making suggestions and proposals for changing things. So what I will ask you first to do is perhaps retrace the evolution of the French higher education sector over the past 20-30 years, because I believe this is a time when it has considerably changed and evolved. And then after that, we'll perhaps broaden the scope and then look at the French academic sector and compare it to try to talk about its characteristics within a European framework, and then later on within an international framework. First, your research of the past 20-30 years and the evolution of the French higher education sector.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation. I think that if I look at the 20-30 years from here, there are three major changes that characterize the transformation of the French higher education system, and more specifically, the university part of this system, because as you probably know, in France, we have universities and we have grandes écoles. There is no translation for that. The grandes écoles are highly selective. Some of them are private and some of them have tuition fees. And then you have universities which are public, not selective, at least to enter, to have access to them, and almost free. And I will first focus on the French universities, because I think that's a part which has experienced the major changes over the 20 last years. And I think there are three major trends, and at least two of them are not specifically French. I think I could say exactly the same for many other countries. So the first one is the raising autonomy of French universities. So as in many European countries, French universities were very dependent on the state, and they were not really able to decide for themselves. And in the last 20 years, they really get more autonomy. Less autonomy than most European universities, I would say, if you look at some of the reports which are published on the autonomy of universities in Europe, you will see that France is most of the time lagging behind, but nevertheless much more autonomy than before. And this particularly happened with the act, which is called Pécresse Act of 2007. And of course, there is in this act some measures empowering the French president of French universities. But more than that, there has been a kind of decision that universities would be then responsible for their payroll. In fact, they were just responsible for their operating budget before. And since the end of the 2000s, they become responsible for their payroll. And so they may decide how they will manage the academic and administrative positions within each university.
Christine, I'm cutting through just to ask you to, a lot of our members, a lot of our audience are around the world and don't necessarily know everything about the French higher education system. Can you just explain, when you talk about increased autonomy for French universities, can you say a couple of words about the way that they are funded? Okay, because the dominant model across the world, or the better known one, is the Anglo-Saxon model, where it's
which doesn't exist,
funded by via tuition fees.
Yeah.
And so a word about that and about what it meant in terms of funding for universities,
Mm-hmm.
that all these different regulations on more autonomy.
Mm-hmm. It's true that in the French system, universities are, first of all, publicly funded, meaning that they receive their budget, and this budget is the operating budget and the budget for the academic and administrative positions from the state. And that's different from some countries, not so many countries, because if you look at all over the world, most universities are public and not private. And from this point of view, they are quite different from other universities because they are mostly publicly funded. Yes, that's probably one point. And the tuition fees are very low in the French system. They are really, it's maybe 300 or 400 euros, 300, yes. So, no, 300, yes, 300 euros per year. So it's really not something which is, of course, that's important for the students who pay for them. But if you look at what is going on in many countries, that's
of course.
rather...
And that didn't change when the
no,
autonomy
it's not a question of funding.
was increased.
In fact, funding did not change that much. It's much more the kind of decision making the university presidents are able to make, and the fact that they are now responsible for the whole budget, which was not the case before, as they were just responsible for the operating budget, so everything about heating and these kinds of things, but not the positions. And so, in fact, the budget of French universities, the responsibility of the president over the budget they had to manage. They now have budgets which are 3 or 4 times higher than they were before. And of course, it gives you much more margin of maneuver if you can decide about the positions that you manage, which was not the case before. Before, when a position was vacant, they had to ask the ministry to reopen the position. It's not the case any longer now. So these are the kind of changes. And on top of that, in 2004, we introduced the Bologna process in France, so meaning that we organized the training program in 3 years for the bachelor, 2 years for the master, and 3 years for the PhD. And when this Bologna process has been introduced, the ministry decided to get rid of the national, I don't know how to translate that. We had kind of national curricula for the different disciplines, and so they disappeared in 2004. They were not very constraining. This maquette, that's the word in French, but they were not very constraining. But nevertheless, there was this idea that you had the same kind of program for the same discipline all over France, and this also disappeared in the mid 2000s. So this plus the Pécresse Act, it gave more autonomy to French universities than they had before.
So what have been the consequences of that? Now that perhaps enough time has elapsed, can you give us an assessment? Has this been a good change? Has this been difficult? Was the transition a smooth one or not at all?
No, it was not a smooth one because for many universities being responsible for such a huge budget from one day to another, even if it was not that sudden, but it meant they had to acquire the skills in order to manage the budget. And many universities are confronted with rather severe budget problems after this delegation of the budget to the universities. I think it's quite difficult to say whether it was good or bad. Anyway, that's the kind of trend that you observe all over the world. More autonomy to universities. That's something that you observe everywhere. They are able now to have kind of strategies that they can really develop and think about because they have more leeway to do that. What we observed in 2011 when we led a study in 3 French universities, and then we had a survey in all French universities, is that it led to a more centralized governance of French universities, giving much more power to the administrative level of universities. So that was one of the consequences of that.
Okay, I'd like you to address another aspect that, for example, is very recurrent in the Anglo-Saxon professional literature, and I believe is a real issue across the world today for the higher education sector, which is the adequacy between the teaching, the orientation of institutions of higher learning, or in terms of preparing students. There's a little bit of a dilemma, put it simply. You know, on one hand, you have the traditional historical mission of the university, which is to educate, encourage young people to develop their critical skills, to discover themselves, think about the world, et cetera, enrich, in other words, their own self intellectually. And then, of course, the mission to prepare young people to make them job worthy on the labor market once they graduate. How can you address that dilemma or dichotomy in the French framework, in the French context, and what it's been like for French universities to have to deal with this issue?
I think that if you look at the national level and the discourse about what is expected from French universities, it's clearly the second objective, which is really dominant now. And the first one is sometimes, I would say, from my point of view, too much forgotten, so that you don't attend the university only to get a job after that, even if it's, of course, very important to take care of that. But sometimes the fact that you also come there just to study, to become a citizen, to get a culture and so on, is sometimes too much forgotten when you look at the performance of universities. And something which is very representative for that in the French case is that the direction within the French ministry, which is in charge of higher education at the university level, was called before General Direction for Higher Education. Now it's General Direction for Higher Education and Professional Insertion. I'm not sure that the word is exact in English, meaning that you must...
labor market integration, something like that, integrating the labor market.
But also take care about their employability and their access to a job. So I think it has really become a dominant objective on universities, and sometimes a too strong objective. I think maybe it's too much emphasis on this objective. Not to say that it should not be there, but it should not be the only one.
But this is as a result of global pressure.
Yes.
This is a general evolution of higher education over the past 20, 30 years across the world.
that's not French.
It's not French. No, the French did. It's not. It's not a French innovation.
Oh.
Not this one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can we step back a little bit now and look at the French higher education system within the scope of Europe? First of all, how does it compare? Does it really have a specificity, or is it very much comparable to other systems in Europe? And then the second question would be, and that's an entirely different matter, even though we're still talking about Europe, is if you could tell us a little bit about what has been done at European level to foster harmonization, exchanges. In other words, what are the policies at European level, and what are the policy goals regarding European universities? So it's two separate questions.
Yeah. Let's start by the first one about France in Europe. And I think that I may be quite different. I may have a quite different discourse from other people, because I think that France is not specific in terms of higher education, and that all systems are specific. I've been working on higher education for 40 years now. And when I'm attending a meeting, a conference on higher education with my other colleagues on working on that topic, we always spent a lot of time, each of us, explaining our own system, you know, so that because the words are exactly the same everywhere. So you say university in Finland, in Finland there's another word, but let's say in Sweden, in Germany, and so on, the word which is very close to this idea of university something. And when you look really precisely at what it means, it's different from one country to another. It's organized differently. The link to the ministry is different. Everything is different from one country to another. And that's one of the problems for the construction of a higher education system, which is that in Europe, a single space of higher education and research in Europe is very difficult to build because of the disparity of the different systems within Europe. So of course there are specificities to France. I completely agree with that. But each time you go to a different system, it's different. And even when you said before the Anglo-Saxon system, I don't know what an Anglo-Saxon system is, because the UK is very different from the US. And within the US, you have 50 states. Each state has its own public system, and they are all different from one another. So, yeah, even the notion of Anglo-Saxon higher education system, for me, is not really something that you can really, it doesn't really exist. And that's the same in Europe. You have very, very different systems. I would spend many hours in order to describe the German system, to describe the UK system, to describe the Swedish system. They are all very different. So in France, we have some specificities, but they are not higher than within other systems. So we have universities, we have the national research institutions, we have the grandes écoles. That's part of our specificity. But in other countries, let's say Germany, you have the universities, you have the Fachhochschulen, and you have also some research institutions. So, and many more than in France, in fact. So, you know, each time you have to look at what is really going on. And we have a specific history of our universities, that's true. But again, that's something that you find almost in every country. So that's for the first thing. We have a specific system within a space of different specific systems. And in terms of constructing a policy at the European level, it's really difficult from this point of view. And so first of all, maybe I should say that the European Commission has no competence on higher education. They are not allowed to make decisions on higher education. And so they always used the margins in order to act or to try to intervene on higher education. And most of the time they use the creation of a European job market to do that. So for instance, the Erasmus program, which is developed in order to facilitate mobility for students and for academics in Europe, it has been developed as a way to increase mobility, the job market mobility in Europe, much more than something on higher education. And I think that my assessment of what is going on within Europe is that you have, instead of having a kind of harmonization, and despite the Bologna process, which I mentioned before, despite of that, I think there is an increasing diversity of situation in Europe. And I'm quite, I have many doubts about the capacity of Europe of building a European area of higher education from that point of view. If you look at the national public policies on higher education in each European country, you really rarely observe that they integrate the European level. I mean by that when you have for instance, an act like the last one we had in France, which is called Loi de Programmation pour la Recherche, an act for the programmation, no, I don't know, for more funding in research or something like that. If you look at it, it doesn't mention the European situation. It doesn't mention what is going on in other countries. The idea is to put more money on research in France in order to be more competitive at the international level. No, there is no, when you look at the transformation of the academic careers, which is part of this act, there is no mention about trying to harmonize academic careers within Europe. The idea is to have solutions for the French system. So, and that's the same if you look at policies in Germany or in the UK on higher education. They are first of all focused on the country itself and not about trying to have harmonization or at least compatibility between the policy you develop at the national level and the European policy. That's a first reason for which I would say that I'm not sure that this European space for higher education is really there. Countries are still competing one against another rather than really cooperating in terms of higher education. And the second one is that in many European countries, the devolution of higher education responsibilities to the regional level, exacerbated the variation. So for instance, if you look at Germany, the fact that the Länder in Germany are each responsible for higher education and that they can make decisions which are quite different from one land to another. It increased the level of variety within Europe in terms of higher education systems. And you have the same in the UK with the big differences that you have now between Scotland, Wales, and England in terms of higher education. So yes, there is, I think that the trend is not so much in the direction of harmonization, despite the Bologna process.
When you say that the different member states, their universities compete against one another, or member states compete against one another, did you mean in terms of research, publication, notoriety? Did you mean in terms of, for example, international student enrollment, that kind of thing?
Yes, yes. They compete for academics, they compete for research resources, they compete for students. And I think that, for instance, what we had in France, the French Excellence Initiative, was not developed in order for France to participate to a European effort, but much more for France to be stronger in the global competition. And that's the same for the German Excellence Initiative. it was not thought as something that would be a plus for Europe, but first of all, something that was a plus for Germany within Europe and within the world. So I think that's something which is still there. So they cooperate, of course, and you have the framework program with a lot of money trying to bring people together to do research together. So you have that at the European level, and that's of course very important. But if you look at the national level, the national levels, they are still very national and really thinking in terms of their own interest.
It's really, I know there's a lot of European initiative regarding the boosting of mobility, academic mobility, as well as students, of course. Students, there's Erasmus, but there's a lot more than Erasmus, especially at graduate level, postgraduate. But I know that there are a lot of initiatives to encourage academic mobility within the European space. But from what you're saying, it looks like it's mainly top down at the European level, initiatives launched at the European level, and bottom up, not much. So it's really interesting because it's perhaps counterintuitive for some of our viewers.
Yeah, and I think that one of the biggest problem to build a European area of higher education is probably the fact that the national academic labor markets, I mean by that, how you develop your career as an academic, is so different from one country to another. So, of course, going from one country to another in Europe is a problem of language, that's for sure. It's a problem about pension, because the pension systems are still very different, but it's also a problem about what is an academic career, how you develop it, and the different situations in Europe, and that they are so different. And from my point of view, that's the main difference maybe with the US system, where you also have very different system from one state to another within the United States, but you have a single academic labor market. So you can be hired by the university on the West Coast or on the East Coast, doesn't matter. The process and the criteria are about the same. Within Europe, it's much more diverse, and you don't have a kind of harmonization of the academic labor market. So you can be mobile and spend 6 months there, but to have your permanent position moving from Spain to Germany or from the Netherlands to France, it's very, very, very difficult still now.
Christine, to conclude, and even though I know it's a difficult question at this particular point in time, I wanted to ask you, it's maybe first impression, even though it's been a year, we know that higher education has been one of the most affected sector. Affected, I'm of course talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you, even though it's still very, very difficult, we're still in hybrid model, a lot of universities across Europe and the rest of the world are still fully online, in fully remote mode. From what you can see right now, do you think the pandemic will have a long-lasting impact, and what sort of impact on higher education?
I think it's, for the moment, I think it's very difficult to know what will remain from the crisis because the crisis is still not finished. And we can guess that because this crisis was so long, some of the solutions which have been developed during this crisis may remain after that, just because we get used to it much more than if it was a very short time crisis. But I think there are 3 levels that may be affected in terms of higher education. The first one is, of course, what you meant, the pedagogical level. So probably we will use more digital processes, digital instruments, digital solutions in our learning. Not all the time. I think that there is a kind of at least right now, people say, I would like to have my, my students back, and the same for the students. I would like to have my teacher back in class. So, but probably a mix of that will be much more present. I think there would also be some transformation in terms of how you work at the university, or the university as a workplace. That's probably also changing, because people have been used to work with more distance, and probably it will change many things in terms of how you lead your research, for instance, how you organize conferences, how you interact, just to take seminars, for instance. I think they will probably become again in presence, but you will still have also something online, so that people all over the place can also attend the seminar. I think that will probably remain. And we will probably have also impact on the governance of universities, because and that's one of the issue we're trying to work on right now. We think that probably the power relations within universities may change with this crisis. Maybe the balance between teaching and research may be affected too. Because,
in what way? What direction?
Because there was such an emphasis on teaching during the last year. You know, it doesn't mean that research did not happen. And some people, of course, use that period in order to do more research. But the pressure for teaching was so strong. I think that may impact maybe the balance between teaching and research in the coming years.
Reinvesting in teaching,
yes,
is what you mean?
Probably. That was something which was already there. There was already this mention of how to introduce innovative pedagogy and to change the way we teach and so on. That was there before the crisis, but I think it became much more central during the crisis. And what we are seeing right now in the universities where we are leading research on this topic, we can see that really all the teaching domain of universities has been much more not attacked, but transformed by the crisis right now than the research part of it. So that's one of the hypotheses I would have for the future. I'm not sure about it, because I think that when we look at literature on crisis, we see that in crisis you can go very far from what you did before during the crisis and come back very quickly to what you did before after the crisis. So let's see what will happen. But because this crisis is so long, we may expect people to learn more from it, and maybe some extraordinary practices becoming ordinary work in the future. Let's see.
Okay, all right. So we'll keep watching as things evolve. Christine, I want to thank you very much. This was fascinating. I would have been happy to continue for another half hour, but we're trying to keep these interviews to relatively reasonable length. Thank you very, very, very much. And I hope to have you here as a guest in the future. Again, perhaps in a year to reassess developments between now and then. Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you to our viewers across the world. Until the next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.